I'd like to talk about why Devastated Dreams is set in the Philippines. And I think the first reason is that it's something that's interesting to me. My wife is Filipino, and we have a number of Filipino friends, and I actually learned about Aswang from them, and I was instantly fascinated by it. So I've sort of immersed myself in the culture and the folklore, and of course my wife looks over everything we do. And so it's been a really interesting experience, and it's something that, I like sharing my interests with you. I like sharing things through the medium of video games with the people who are interested in the games that I make. It's also important to me to know about Filipino culture and to be interested in it because my wife and I were expecting our first child who will probably identify as Filipino. And so I'd like to be part of that aspect of my child's life. So I think learning about the culture and learning about the folklore, and all aspects of it, really. I tried learning a little bit of the language, Tagalog, but Tagalog is very hard, at least for me, to learn. I'm very bad at learning languages. I think another thing that's really great about the Philippines is that it's an area that hasn't been touched in any other games that I know of. The closest I can think of is Dread Out, which was based in Indonesia, which certainly has a whole different and also interesting cultural traditions. So it seems foreign and different and exciting to me, at least as an American, and certainly I've been there, and it definitely felt very foreign. More foreign than say traveling to Europe, where there's a lot of the same cultural traditions, Western culture. But the Philippines is a very interesting region, particularly because of its influence by Western culture as well as Eastern culture. So the Philippines was occupied by Spain for a long time in terms of its history, and then was in the Spanish-American War, Spain traded it to the U.S., and then it was captured by the Japanese in World War II, and then given its independence. So it's interesting even to look at the Philippines from a historical standpoint. It's sort of a new, obviously not new in terms of people living there, but it's new in terms of independence, relatively, on the grand scheme of things, and forging its own cultural identity. And so there's a lot of Spanish last names, there's a lot of Spanish influence, and I think ethnically, it's a mixture of Spanish settlers, the native islanders, and various Chinese who've come over to the Philippines over, periods of hundreds of years. So I think it's very interesting. Well, I mean, again, I just sort of went on things that interest me. Maybe they don't interest you. Maybe you're not as interested in folklore or culture as I am. But I think that it's really interesting from a horror standpoint, which obviously is a bigger interest to me personally than culture or folklore or anything. Horror is sort of my bread and butter. It's something very near and dear to me. And the Aswang are particularly fascinating because they're almost so foreign and alien, but yet they share some interesting commonalities with American monsters. Like, a lot of these Aswang are damaged or fear garlic or can't go where there's garlic, which seems very analogous to that of a vampire. But then there's other things. They they fear holy water, which is sort of the Catholic and Spanish influence. Although, do vampires like holy water? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe they don't like it either. But holy water is a big thing. I'm not sure if Aswangs are scared by crosses specifically, but then something sort of completely foreign is a stingray tail whip. So you make a whip out of stingray tails, and I don't know how exactly you connect these stingray tails, or maybe you just use stingray skin over a regular whip. I'm not quite sure. I haven't seen a real stingray tail whip. But this is another thing you can use to fight a Aswang and drive them away, which is completely different and foreign. So the Philippines it's interesting because of its melting pot of Western and Eastern influences, but also I think the region is a very interesting place right now. Because there's a fair amount of poverty and a fair amount of people living without electricity, living without running water, and that is something that makes me feel vulnerable. And so if you look at Neverending Nightmares and a lot of horror, I think there's like a Crimson Peak movie coming out, and I don't know what time period it is, but it's set in. But there's sort of that Victorian era, that the era of Dracula, where everything is lit by candlelight and all that stuff. It seems more ripe for horror, right? Because if you're attacked by a monster, you have your cell phone, you call 911 or whatever, or Ghostbusters or something, right? Like it's not. You feel less vulnerable when you're connected to other people. But that's not something that people can say all over the world, and that's not something that everyone in the Philippines has access to. I think the Philippines is like, I don't know, won some awards for being like most digitally connected in Asia or something. I mean, there's a ton of people using Facebook and mobile phones, but like to some extent that's almost a new thing, because I talked to my wife, and growing up she didn't have a landline phone, so they didn't have a landline phone at all, and so if they had to make a telephone call to someone, they would have to go to someone else's house who had landline, and they were very sort of rare and expensive, and certainly cell phone towers and stuff is changing that. I don't know if they built out, a ton of infrastructure, but it wasn't like my wife grew up in a very rural area at all. But just telephone landlines were not common, which just sort of blows my mind, right? Because you think about in America, right, and you go back to like, I don't know, the 50s or something, everyone had their telephone, right? Bell telephone or whatever, gave them out, I think. Certainly I wasn't alive then, but you look at old stuff, everyone has a telephone, they call their friends on the telephone, and certainly growing up, we had a student directory. You want to ask your best friend to hang out or whatever, you call them up on the telephone, and it's interesting to see that was not something that's sort of universal across the world, and I think that's one of the big interests, is just the idea that, my experience growing up, white American in Michigan, is certainly not characteristic of everyone's experience, and definitely not characteristic of the experience in the Philippines, which is what we're exploring in this game. And I think that's a really powerful thing we can do with the medium of video games, is we can explore different backgrounds, put ourselves in different shoes. And that's something very exciting to me, because through the medium of interactivity, you're giving someone an experience more than watching a movie or reading a book. You can be in that shoes. You can see how things work. I mean, obviously, we're constraining it to a very horrific experience, and the horror is central to Devastated Dreams more so than communicating about the Philippines. But I think, and I hope that by playing the game, or even just playing the demo, which is available, as part of our Kickstarter, people will gain some knowledge of the Philippines. People will see that some people in the Philippines, maybe not many, but there are people who still live in the nipa huts, which are constructed out of bamboo and grass. That's the way some people live, and again, that's mind blown, right? Like, I mean, there's some basically like sort of shanty town or something, so some very poor sort of makeshift housing in a different area of the Philippines, and I think apparently, according to my wife at least, they have electricity provided to them, but then there's other people who, for whatever reason, I mean, probably poverty, but I don't know, maybe some people really like the rural lifestyle. I don't know, certainly not for me with my asthma and my lack of camping skills and all that stuff, but it's sort of a different way that people live, and it's not completely foreign, and I think my grandmother-in-law, lived without running water, and so when Joanne, my wife, would go to visit her, I mean, that would be they would have to go to the outhouse, and that's something that just seems alien to me, and I think it's interesting to almost preserve these snapshots of a style of life, because the way the world is moving so fast, it's going to be tough to explain to my child and all of our children, what life was like before there were cell phones, what life was like before they had the internet, before they had access to all this global communication and information. And I think it's changing culture, and to some extent, I think that individual culture is becoming a bit more homogenized. Everyone's wearing jeans. Everyone's eating hamburgers across the world because we're able to share these knowledge. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I do think that it's important that culture and the differences in culture are preserved, because, I mean, at least that's something I'm very interested in. Anyway, I apologize if this was long and sort of rambling, but as you can see, this game and what it means is something that I care about very deeply. So, thanks for watching.